Hi there, and welcome to this week's episode of Truffle Talks. I'm James Stephen, the editor of Truffle Report, and Truffle Talks is our new interview series where we sit down with the movers and shakers defining psychedelic business, policy reform, science, and culture. Joining us today is Payton Nyquvest, CEO of Numinus Wellness. Numinus was an early entry into the realm of publicly traded psychedelics companies and set an important regulatory milestone for the industry when they became the first publicly traded entity to complete a legal psilocybin harvest way back in October of 2020, which I don't know about all of you, but that feels like a million years ago to me now. We are probably going to be talking about some more recent developments, but first I'm going to let Payton introduce himself and Numinus a little more thoroughly. Payton, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah. So a little bit on myself. I very, very fortunate enough to come to this space as a patient first. I was fortunate enough to have psychedelic therapy save my life a number of years ago when I had sort of met the limitations of the Western medical system, suffering with severe chronic pain. And after coming out of that experience, really just trying to figure out how I could give back to something that had saved my life, and just recognize that there was more than just philanthropy that I could do. And that's really where Numinus was birthed from, was how can we work alongside regulators and not-for-profit and academic groups to advance research, but also, what can we do to try and create as much accessibility as possible for people? And that's where Numinus really wants to focus and continues to focus. Our mission is around accessibility. And we do that twofold through Numinus Health, which is our clinical infrastructure, where we do not only ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, but we're also in collaboration with MAPS and their work with PTSD for MDMA, which we can actually hold out of our clinical locations, as well as Numinus Bioscience, which is our Health Canada licensed lab and production facility that's licensed by Health Canada to not only do analytical testing, but also production and importation and exportation of pretty much all the known psychedelic compounds. And as you mentioned, grew, from what we can tell, the first legal psilocybin mushrooms since the 70s, which was in last October, which, as you said, feels like an infinity ago. But,
I remember writing that article when it happened and being very excited about it. I checked around pretty thoroughly. I think I could say you were the first legally since the 70s.
Well, I'll let you say that. But yeah, it was very, very cool.
If someone wants to contradict me, we can get them on the next interview. It's fine.
I would actually be super interested to hear who would have some more information there. So yeah.
From what I could find, but anyway, please.
Cool. Yeah. So that's really the focus of the company. So it's been obviously an amazing year in the space, and I think for us and for the industry, it's also we're barely out of the start gate at the moment. And I think, the future, and especially into 2022, looks really, really exciting.
All right. So I'm going to take it big picture right now. And I understand that your views personally, even though you're the CEO, are probably going to differ a little bit from the views of Numinus, the entity.
Sure.
But let's just say, big picture, what do you personally think the goal of this thing that we are calling the Psychedelic Renaissance should be? And how does that inform your decision-making for Numinus?
Yeah, it's a great question. It still feels bizarre to me to call like the psychedelics industry. Even the fact that I get to like masquerade as the CEO of a psychedelic CEO.
We're gonna revisit masquerade in a second. Do we have a little bit of imposter syndrome going on here?
Maybe. Or pinch myself. I can't believe this is reality. But
see, that part I understand. I wonder what the 16 or 17-year-old version of myself would think of this line of work I'm in right now. And
totally.
It's something I talk to people a lot about at conferences, actually. Like, what are we doing here? Wow, how did this happen?
I'm with you. And especially, with the trajectory it's been on too. But yeah, I think talking about the psychedelic renaissance and personally where I would like to see the conversation go is, I think, we do so much research around indication treatment, and, you see treatment-resistant PTSD, treatment-resistant depression, suicidality, depression, anxiety, substance use disorder, which is really, really important work. But I think what we really need to look at and not forget is, where does psychedelic therapy fit as a modality within a client's healing path? This obviously one of the very large reasons why this reemergence of psychedelic research is happening is because we've recognized that there's significant limitations to the current treatments for a wide range of mental health treatments. So if we recognize that, and there's this opportunity for psychedelics to take, this really, really heavy burden off of the healthcare system, why are we putting it at the end in terms of prioritization as a treatment modality? People shouldn't have to wait until they're treatment resistant, or, they've ran
dying
through
of cancer or what
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
It should, as long as they're safe and they meet the eligibility criteria, it should be used as a standard of care. We shouldn't have to put them on 3 different SSRIs. We shouldn't have to put them through all this, unnecessary suffering to go like, oh, okay, well, you've suffered enough. Now we can put you through psychedelic therapy. It's not doing the job, like the job of alleviating that burden on the healthcare system that we need it to do. And I think, with psychedelics, if you look at the MAPS data, 3 treatments of MDMA for treatment-resistant PTSD, and 66% of people no longer met the PTSD criteria. That's a cure in, a window of like 3 to 6 months. That's incredible. And these are people who've probably been, through a whole bunch of modalities for over 10 years, right?
Particularly with the veteran patient subset, there's been yeah.
Well, and to that point, you think about veterans, you think about first responders. These are people their job is trauma, and if you have a debilitating mental health issue, you can't work. And for someone who might be 35 years old, that's crushing for them. It's crushing for their family. And meanwhile, there's a treatment here that could potentially get them back to such a higher quality of life in a shorter time period. And so I think where I would really love to see the industry continue to evolve is, yes, we need to continue to do research, but let's really work with regulators and work with the existing healthcare system to create a standard of care, and frankly, a standard of care that has curative intent. And I think that's the work that we need to be doing. And I think the other final thing I'll say about that is, we keep finding that psychedelics are so helpful for all of these different indications. And it's because what they do is they treat trauma, and all of these indications are different expressions of trauma. There's a few maybe underlying outliers, but for the most part, it's people who've had a traumatic event in their life at a certain period in their life that has led to depression or anxiety or suicidality or substance use disorder. And so I think the continuing education around trauma and trauma-informed care is a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, but I think something really not to be taken lightly.
Okay, so we're definitely going to come back to that towards the end of this, but right now I just want to go to the patients, because they're kind of what it's all about here, and just try to ask where Numinus is with patient care. We've actually spoken, not for this series, but on a couple of different occasions, to Dr. Joe Flanders of Mindspace. And I've talked to him, had a really great conversation with him about just sort of safety protocols around the ketamine therapy that they were doing in Montreal. So I think that's a good thing we can touch on here. But I'd also just like to know what you've learned so far from that, from working, clinical and clinical trial operations. And maybe you could speak a bit towards the acquisition of the Neurology Center of Toronto back in September as well, in terms of what that does for patients and for Numinus moving forward.
And I'll maybe start there. One of the
that was a lot, so you can start at the last thing I said, and work backward.
Sure. Going back to what I was just talking about around prioritizing psychedelic therapy as a modality. One of the things that we saw at the Neurology Center of Toronto, and they do a lot of work with people with epilepsy and concussion. And one of the things that was recognized was, while there's a traumatic, so we'll take concussion as an example. One of the things that we saw was take three clients, one person who's bonked their head on a table, one person who's slipped and fallen on concrete, and another person who's been T-boned at 80 miles an hour. One of the things we saw with over 50% of the clients was those three people had the same symptoms and they got worse over time, which a trauma injury, like a physical trauma injury, that's not how it works. It's usually more severe based on the level of impact, and it usually heals over time. It's usually the worst at the very beginning. But what we saw was that people started to identify with the diagnosis, and then there would be an underlying mental health issue that would be triggered based off of that. And it would be the self-fulfilling prophecy of symptoms that becomes so looping that you actually can't even treat the concussion without alleviating the mental health issue first, right? And so
this is something I don't want to cut you off, but I'm just going to say this is something I have experienced, not personally, but I have a family member, an older one, who is a bike messenger here in Toronto for many years. And when you're a bike messenger in Toronto for many years, you get hit by a lot of cars. And this is my uncle, and he has had several concussions and ultimately, been diagnosed with a couple of neurological disorders and things of that nature after so much of this. And the symptoms and the mental health issues, they, as you said, they do not start to heal on their own. They keep getting better. It's a very cumulative thing, even though he's now retired and no longer doing this. So we all probably know someone who is suffering from this. That's the other thing I want to just throw out there too, is that these are actually very common things. We're speaking about them in, clinical-ish terms here, but odds are listeners, watchers, somebody.
Exactly. And that's, going back to my comments before about trauma, is it's sort of like the most literal representation of how trauma manifests into this really hard pattern to interrupt. And so with neurological services is we see this really amazing intersection of traditional mental health treatments, neurology, and psychedelics being sort of the bridge between all of those things to really look at someone's health and well-being. And, human beings are sort of like onions. You pull another layer, and then there's another layer, and there's another layer. And so for us, where our focus has been is how do we provide the highest potential outcomes for our clients? And, you've seen this sort of like land rush in the psychedelic space, especially with ketamine, and in particular in the US at the moment. And, I think it's great that more accessibility is coming out there, but I also think we need to be really careful.
And that was a good piece of what our conversation with Dr. Flanders was about too, is of all the practitioners I interviewed, it was a whole series on ketamine safety. I would say he was the most cautious in terms of his protocols, and, spoke well of Numinus and said that that's something you guys have very frequent conversations about.
Yeah, we do. And I think, it's something that needs to be taken with a lot of caution. I mean, ketamine is a dissociative. It's a very, very powerful tool with a lot of potential, but it needs to be used in a very intentional way. And I think, some of the things that I see that are concerning, one, obviously this whole mail to home ketamine model is in many ways terrifying to me.
Yeah, the whole concept of like ketamine telehealth, where you have these repeat customers, and
it's dangerous. I mean, ketamine is addictive, especially with someone who is prone to dissociation. It definitely has addictive qualities to it. And so I think that's something we need to be really, really cautious about. And I think the other thing we need to be cautious about is how we market these things, right? You see these billboards up where people just advertise psychedelic therapy. Come get your psychedelic therapy. And, it's sort of like if I was going to advertise a certain car as like, come buy a car, it's different. And I think for so many people who are hearing little snippets of the research with psychedelics, and just painting that with a very broad brush could really set their expectations really, really high. And not that ketamine doesn't have like vast potential, but I think we just really need to be careful about setting expectations. And, these aren't magic pills or panaceas. They take a lot of work. And that's, for us in the Numinus model as well, is we really look at, what are all of the additional services that need to be wrapped around psychedelic therapy in order to be effective for people. And I think one of the biggest validators of that lately, if you look at the MAPS research and the Compass data that came out, if you look at the MAPS protocol, it's 3 treatments, it's a lot of integration, it's a lot of preparation support, and there's a lot of holding through that process. So you see this.
If you have people coming back again and again and again for the substance, like it happen in some of these ketamine clinics in the States, that's a problem. If they're coming back for 2 or 3 treatments and then having a whole bunch of integration and psychotherapy sessions after that, probably a bit more effective and a lot less dangerous.
Yep, exactly. And I think, again, going back to the MAPS results and the Compass results are probably the 2 most significant research results that we have in the space at the moment. Again, the MAPS results, lots of therapeutic support, very intentional therapeutic container. On the other side of it, you have the Compass data, which sees, this really big spike in like the initial dosing data, right? 67% or something like that of people saw a significant reduction in their symptoms. And then you see it taper off really fast. And if you look at the therapeutic protocol, it's 1 dosing session, limited therapy, and 2 integration sessions. And anybody who knows anything about psychedelic therapy knows like that doesn't cut it, right? And so I think it shows 2 things. 1, psilocybin has the potential to be really, really effective as a tool. And 2, it's not a magic pill, and it does need really intentional clinical therapeutic support and community around that. And so I think both very, very important. And again, for Numinus, that's really what we've been aiming to create is
that's why you're building the business, not so much on the substance itself.
Exactly. The substance
is important.
Yeah, they're really powerful tools. If I'm building a house, I want really, really good tools, but I really want to make sure that the people who are using them know how to use them.
Yeah. The roof doesn't leak.
Exactly.
Got it. All right. So why don't we actually talk a bit more about the partnership with MAPS? I believe you're with MAPS Canada and the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation you're working with, correct?
So it's actually MAPS USA and the MAPS PBC.
PBC, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And, just about it's a big deal to getting that, good science done and building clinical and research infrastructure. And, tell us a bit about how that's really furthering the goals of both organizations. Because I'm assuming there's a reason you 2 picked each other instead of, the many other entities out in this space. There's got to be some alignment there.
Yeah. And, feel very, very fortunate when I founded Numinus, we sort of had this whiteboard wish list of, who we would want to work with and support. And MAPS was always number 1 on that list. So really, really grateful to be able to work with them. MAPS, obviously 35 years they've been doing this, very high integrity organization. And tenacious and obviously very selective and cagey in terms of who they want to work with. They've got the ball on the 5-yard line at the moment and they don't want to fumble it.
They're very close to achieving their goals.
They really are. The anticipation is MDMA being legal for therapy in 2023. That's really right around the corner. And so, the collaboration really came out of a lot of relationships that have been built between the 2 organizations over the last few years. Dr. Evan Wood, who's our chief medical officer, his previous outfit, the British Columbia Center on Substance Use, actually ran the Vancouver site for the MAPS phase 2 work. So a long-standing relationship with MAPS. And I think the 2 organizations just see a lot of alignment, philosophically in terms of, we really believe in accessibility and not making these therapies restrictive or anything like that. And I also, from a personal standpoint, and I would also speak on behalf of our organization is, we think it's really important that a not-for-profit group is the first group to bring as a very large psychedelic compound forward. I think it sets the tone for what this space is really all about and focusing on accessibility and service to people. So, what that looks like in terms of the partnership really is a fewfold. One, there's a huge gap in terms of enough trained therapists to be able to actually do the work. So that's been a huge focus of that collaboration. Getting therapists trained, getting the workforce up and running. And the other one is, the MAPS protocol is an amazing protocol, and there's nuances to it that are built for research that might not really make sense in a real world setting. And so that partnership has really been for us to start to move that protocol into a real world setting, start to make a few adjustments, so that it's just, really efficient and ready to go. When time comes with MDMA, and two is, again, just supporting the research. Everything the Numinus can do to support the research and get the data there, and ready to go. And I think for us, why that's also really important is, I think important to remember, a lot of the clients that are going to be coming through for psychedelic therapy are going to be referred by referring physicians, and that data is really, really important. And we want to create a high level of trust and comfort for referring physicians that they're going to send their clients to us, and we're going to do a really good job by them.
Right. Because there's going to be a lot of people new to this, a lot of people hearing about this, a lot of people wanting to try this, and making sure the referring physicians feel comfortable with that.
Yep. Exactly.
Sending people to you or to MAPS or to whoever is a pretty important step in the process. Okay. So I think, as we start to wrap up, I would just like to ask, if you have anything to say about Numinus's listing to the Toronto Stock Exchange.
Yeah. The company, the plan with the company always, and it's been quite a trajectory in terms of going from where we've come to now TSX main board uplisting, which we're really, really excited about, continuing to validate and bring legitimacy to the space in general, and also to Numinus also. And really from there, where we see 2022 is a much more senior tiered US uplisting as well, whether that's NASDAQ or NYSE. The company is just doing that work also, but continuing to broaden the awareness for the space and for the company, and add credibility and legitimacy. I think one of the things that's really, really exciting about this space is because we're talking about FDA clinical trials, there's a lot of ability for a vast array of institutions and financial supporters to come into the space. Whereas, obviously with something like cannabis, that was a challenge for a long time. So
cannabis banking and cannabis finance is still a bit of a rocky road.
It is
south of the border.
Yeah, it
here
is.
too, but there's been a lot of hurdles there because the medical side hasn't really fleshed out the way a lot of people thought it would. So it's good that we're starting here.
Exactly. And so for the company, it's really just being able to hit all those different markets and continue to raise the profile of the company.
All right. Well, I think that's a pretty great place to leave it. Great. Once again, thanks for tuning in to this week's Truffle Talks. I'm James Stephen, the editor of Truffle Report, and this has been Payton Nyquvest of Numinus. You can find us online at truffle.report or as Truffle Report on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn, and Truffle_Report on Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit. See you next week.